Hi, Stephen and colleagues. Thank you very much for that introduction. I think our bios sound much more impressive, Stephen, when you read them than when we think about our own work. So thank you. My name's Ruth Stewart, and as the introduction explained, I'm the director of the Africa Centre for Evidence and the chairperson of the Africa Evidence Network. Our team here in Johannesburg has been working together for many years now to support the use of evidence for decision making. And we're going to be drawing on 3 different areas of our work today. From 2014 to 2016, the UK Department for International Development supported us in a big programme to build capacity to use research evidence. We were known as UJBCure. And I'm going to share, to start off, some high-level insights from that programme. And my colleagues Siziwe and Laurenz are going to talk about some of the insights from 2 of our biggest legacies from that work. So, to start us off, our BCure work was supporting governments in Malawi and in South Africa. And as part of that, I think our greatest insight, in particular when setting out in this kind of work, is about making sure that you meet people's needs and avoid duplication, that you're complementing other people's work that's already going on and not assuming that you're starting from scratch and that there's always a deficit that you're going to meet, that there's not always the problem you think you're solving may not be the problem that is actually on the ground. We did some landscape reviews as part of that work, and we learned a lot, both in trying to assess the landscapes and in presenting them back to our colleagues in government and allowing them to reflect on what they felt were really the needs on the ground. The illustration here on the slide is a landscape scanning that we have done around organisations across Africa supporting evidence-informed policymaking. And there's over 150 different organisations across the continent, just highlighting this, this insight about the need to think about what's happening on the ground before we start something new. My second insight is around the need for multiple approaches to support evidence use over time to meet these needs. We have experienced again and again how isolated, time-bound initiatives fade very quickly. We've done a piece of work and we use this spiral illustration to show that there are people working at different levels, at individual level and team and organisation, and that they move around a kind of spectrum for evidence use of understanding what needs to be done, engaging with evidence, gaining capacity to use that evidence, and moving around again to another understanding of need of where evidence might be useful. And this, so we've reflected on this idea of spirals that people learn, and that there are multiple points across that spiral where you can intervene. Within our UJBCure programme, we had 2 main programmes. One was workshops to share capacity around evidence-informed decision-making with government colleagues. And the second one built on those workshops, which was to offer mentorship for more one-to-one and team support to use evidence. And only through the combination of these 2 and a number of other related pieces were we able to make some progress with colleagues in how we generate evidence and how they use evidence in decision-making. If I move on to our third insight from that programme, I might have hinted at it then when I referred to capacity sharing. So when we started, and in fact it's within the programme name, building capacity to use research evidence, we assumed that we had the capacity and we just needed to help these decision makers in government to learn what we knew, and then they could do their job better. We realised really quickly that we actually were the ones with the deficit. We needed to learn what they did in order to provide better evidence and support them. So whilst we definitely are rejecting now this terminology around building capacity, we sometimes talk about capacity development, and our preferred term is actually around capacity sharing, because we've realised how much we learn from others, probably far more, when we set out to support evidence use for decision making. I mentioned earlier that there were 2 key legacies from this programme, and one of them is about a network that we built. So it was already in place. The Africa Evidence Network has existed since 2012, but our BCure DFID-funded programs supported the growth of the network. And I'm going to pass across to Siziwe now to talk a little bit about insights from our Africa Evidence Network.
Thank you very much, Ruth. I think the work of Africa Evidence Network is very exciting because I joined in 2017 whilst they've already built the network. So basically, what I'm interested in also about this network is the fact that it strengthens networks and it breaks down the silos, because that is the most important thing, to see how we best break down these silos. And also, the network is a broad community of more than 2,096 diverse people across the continent and beyond, and spanning across 6 different dimensions. So our membership is individuals that are interested in the use and production of evidence. So these people are from different sectors, and that is what is unique about Africa Evidence Network. We have all these members that are interested in this work. And also, I think the photo that is attached to this insight is a photo of one of our events, which is Evidence 2018, which is an event that brings together more than 500 individuals to chat and see how we learn from each other and break down these silos. And then the second insight from the network, the evidence network networks contribute to the raising of the profile of evidence-informed decision-making across the continent. I think in last year, we launched a leadership award, which is an award that we wanted to showcase individuals that are doing work in the space, and also be able, so that they can be able to share their work in the continent, and also be able to share their work across the continent and beyond. So that's something also that we thought is important for us to try and raise that profile. And we use different methods also to raise the profile. We have a newsletter that we do on a monthly basis where we share different stories of this work across the continent and beyond, and using also our events to share this. So that is one of the things that we also do. And then the third insight, as a network, we're responsive to the need and consent of what others are doing is key. We strive to develop a sustained and member-driven network. So basically, we consult with other stakeholders and work together with those other stakeholders to strengthen the work that we do, because we are aware that we are not the only ones that are in the space. So it's important for us to work together with the other stakeholders to strengthen the work that the network is doing, and also to involve our members in terms of how we drive and lead the network's growth. And now I will pass to my colleague, Laurenz, so he will share his own legacies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Siziwe, for these amazing insights from the AEN. So I'm Laurenz, and I work on all things evidence synthesis at ACE, and I will try to give you 3 insights from our second legacy of the UJBQ program. And that refers to the co-production of useful evidence bases with government. And this is work that has been more or less running since 2015, in particular with one government department here in South Africa, the Department for Planning, Monitoring, Evaluation, DPME, but a similar model which we've used with other government departments now here in South Africa too. So our first insight might actually not sound that insightful to you at a first glance. It refers to that EIPM should be demand-led and start with the policymakers, which you would think is a fairly common sense thing to do. But it is quite striking how often in our field and in our own work we've talked about using evidence and making decisions without putting the user of evidence herself at the center of these work efforts. So you see on the right a lovely picture where the then Minister of Science and Technology is advising Ruth Stewart on the direction which to go to. And I think that reflects quite nicely what we have learned, or what we had to learn in our work with government. It's quite often the decision makers themselves that lead the work, and we try to fit into this direction and help them finding the path. And so it is not a deficit model in which we look at the decision maker as somebody who might be lacking skills, or might be lacking understanding, or might be lacking interest in the use of evidence, but as somebody who actually is driving the direction and who we try to support on their path towards the use of evidence defined on their terms. Our second insight refers to the development of responsive evidence bases and not fireworks of single studies. And what we mean by that is that we're trying to emphasize that we want to look at a body of evidence and not individual primary studies. And this body of evidence, or these evidence bases, could consist of systematic reviews, evidence maps, rapid evidence assessments, etc. But it is distinctively more than single studies. And the reason why we try to emphasize that is that quite often for policymakers, it is a bit like a firework of primary studies. The first picture you see on the left. Today, I might send my study to our government colleagues saying, well, I found a great solution to land reform in South Africa, and I have a beautiful policy brief. And then tomorrow, Siziwe might have a tweet campaign showing a completely different approach to how to serve land reform based on her research. So quite often it's a bit, if you sit in a policy organization, like all these primary studies, they pop up on your desk and they want your attention, and it's really amazing how much there's produced, but it's quite tricky to see the overall picture, like what is the pattern here in the evidence base. So that's what we learned quite quickly, that if we want to systemically inform decision making with our government colleagues, that we need towards looking into evidence bases and how to produce these evidence bases. And I think in that what we've particularly learned around evidence bases, that there's not one way to produce them or not the best way, but it probably consists of a range of things, that these evidence bases need to be trustworthy from a methods perspective, that likewise they need to be relevant to policy frameworks and also legitimate in the eyes of the policy stakeholders. And just to share as one example, the second screenshot you see on the left, which is DPME's own approach to develop evidence bases, which is based on evidence mapping methodology. But just to say that there's quite a few different ways, but that principle of using a body of evidence as opposed to primary studies was one of our key insights. Then our third insight, what we learned over the last couple of years, relates to politics. So quite often, if you speak around evidence-informed, evidence-based policymaking, you can be quite sure that somebody mentions in the audience, yes, but what about the politics? The minister will just do whatever she would like to do, and she's going to ignore my research evidence anyway. It's all about politics. Politics determine everything. And while there's an element of truth to it, surely policymaking is inherently a political process and rightfully should be so. What we found is that each decision has political elements, but EDGMAS has technical elements. And it's about finding the right balance between the two. So while we learned fairly quickly that a linear model of research uptake might be a bit naive to assume we just go from the evidence straight to the decision, but it might be equally naive to think that everything is politics, that every single decision is entirely based on politics only. And so I think our learning has moved towards trying to identify the sweet spot between the politics and between the technical processes, or what we've tried to term the art and science of using evidence, assuming that each policy has both a bit of art of using evidence and a bit of a science, technical, replicable processes of using evidence.
So just to wrap up, thank you, Laurenz and Siziwe, for those insights on those legacies from the BQ work that we are continuing to invest in. You may well have picked up that something that underlies all of what we do is the relationships that we build. And we really believe that it's through our investment in relationship building that all the initiatives that we undertake at ACE to support evidence-informed policymaking, it's through those relationships that they have an impact. So there are lots of different tools available to support decision making, and we don't want to devalue those. But when I hear people talk about toolkits, it usually sets off a red flag in my mind, because toolkits are not the things that make a difference. It's the relationships that are actually the conduit to using the many different tools that we all employ to support evidence-informed policymaking. It's those relationships that make sure that there is an impact and that enable us to meet needs, to meet decision makers where they are, to ensure what we're doing is demand led, and to make sure that what we are investing our time in has a real impact. Thank you very much. I hope that has been insightful.
Thank you, Ruth and team. That was an excellent presentation. We'll just pass it over to John now to share his insights, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A following that.
Thanks. Steve, can you just reassure me that you can hear me okay? Steve?
Sorry, I was just on mute myself. Yes, I can hear you fine.
Great, super. All right. Thank you very, very much, Ruth, Siziwe, and Laurenz. Fantastic presentation. I've heard each of you present multiple times, and you make such a great team. So a couple of comments, and then I have a question for each of you. So I'll start with the comments. So the one which strikes me every time I hear one of these three talented individuals or the team as a whole that is always so remarkable to me is the humility. I think if you go back over their insights, almost every one reflects a deep appreciation for the fact that everybody is bringing strengths to the table here, and that if we're going to get far, fast together, we need to recognize those strengths. So, their first message about meeting needs, avoiding duplication, and most importantly, complementing others' work. They don't purport to have all the solutions. They purport to bring to the table part of what is needed, and they recognize the incredible strengths that other people bring to the table. Second example was in their insight number 3 on capacity sharing. Just the language alone and the thought that has gone into that language around capacity sharing. It's not that they, again, have all of the capacity themselves. They have certain types of capacity that they're very happy to share, but they also want to build their own capacity to understand and navigate policymaking environments. Their insight number 6, that networks need to be responsive to needs. Again, recognizing that across Africa and across both the evidence synthesis and the evidence use communities, there are so many different strengths and so many different types of needs, and that the Africa Evidence Network, among the other networks that they support, need to respond to those needs. And then insight number 7, that evidence-informed policymaking needs to be demand-led. This isn't something that researchers can do to policymakers. Researchers and others at the Africa Center for Evidence need to be taking their cues from people in policymaking and other decision-making environments. So that first comment is really just about how wonderful the humility is, and this among what I think to be one of the great groups in the world in terms of thoughtful contributors, unbelievably methodologically rigorous, and incredibly attentive to the nuances of and many strengths in our existing communities in their region, but also globally. So that's comment 1, just kudos to the team for the way that they engage their peers, their colleagues, the other people with whom they work. So the second set of comments have to do with 3 areas where I think the Africa Center for Evidence does extraordinary and world-leading research. One would be in the evidence synthesis area, and I just wrote down 3 things that are particularly notable about ACE's approach. One is the demand-led orientation, and just a few days ago they announced work that they're planning to do to inform work being done at the national level in South Africa. Tremendous potential to have impacts entirely demand-led. Second is the reliance on bodies of evidence, the recognition that we shouldn't be focused on single studies, we should be focused on syntheses of those studies, but also different types of syntheses that can speak to different aspects of particular policy issues. And then the final strength on the evidence synthesis type is the multiple types of outputs they produce. And this is one of the question I wanted to direct at Laurenz. It would be really helpful, I think, for webinar participants to get a feel for that range of types of outputs. So you went through them fast, but the evidence maps, the full systematic reviews, and not just systematic reviews of effects. It would just be helpful to have you describe those multiple types of evidence. So this comment was about the evidence synthesis front, demand-led, multiple bodies of evidence, and multiple types of outputs, all very, very strong contributions on that front. On capacity sharing, I just had two comments. One was this very important point about understanding needs, and we have come over time to realizing that the different types of capacity that need to be shared, evidence synthesis is one of the five, but another more process-oriented one is stakeholder engagement. I think ACE does tremendous work, and the Africa Evidence Network does tremendous work on that front. And then the others are three types of analyses. So policy analysis, political analysis, and systems analysis. So and those are in fact ones that often policymakers are better positioned than us to do. They live and breathe policy analysis. They live and breathe political analysis, and we can learn a lot from them. And again, ACE's and AEN's focus on capacity sharing, I think, gets it exactly right on this front, that we have a lot to learn from people in the policy world, just as we, I hope, bring some things to the table. My question in this category of capacity sharing is for Siziwe, and I just thought it might be helpful if you could take a few minutes to describe the database of capacity sharing opportunities. I think one of the AEN's huge contributions is to allow people to share opportunities for capacity sharing, and it might just be helpful for you to describe that database, and I'm pretty sure this is publicly available. Just perhaps point people to the URL so they can access that database. And then the final one is network support, and we've heard about the Africa Evidence Network, but the wonderful thing is that the Africa Center for Evidence also supports some other networks. I think it supports some groups of policymakers that have a shared interest in evidence-informed policymaking. I think it plays a key role, and I'm probably going to get the name wrong, but I think it's the Collaboration for Environmental Evidence or something like that. So a community of people involved in environmental evidence synthesis, and it brings together people from across Africa every 2 years who have a shared passion for supporting evidence-informed decision-making. And so my question here, either for Siziwe or for Ruth, would just be, if you're willing to talk about it quickly, a sense about how to access some of the resources from your last conference. I think that some of those are publicly available. You captured a lot of them on videos, and I believe you're planning to do another conference 2 years out, which is maybe now 18 months out. So if you have any information on that conference, it would be good. Often people plan many months, if not years in advance with their travel schedule, and it would be wonderful if that major Africa conference could be on people's radar. So those are our substantive comments. I think exemplary job on the evidence synthesis side, also on capacity sharing, and also on network support, with just some targeted follow-up questions about, could you explain a bit more about the types of outputs, explain a bit more about the database, and perhaps explain a bit more about the conference. And then my final comment, and I'm now taking more time than the presenters, so I'll shut up, but one thing that I've learned from the group is that there are multiple pathways to supporting evidence use, and I think one of their final insights was on this point, and I think that's exactly right. Bringing the evidence syntheses to the table, ones that are demand-led from the beginning and so on, is key. Sharing capacity so the research community becomes more attentive to policy concerns, the policy community becomes sensitized to the importance of evidence, and then building networks, taking advantage of where people are already coming together and trying to nurture those networks so that people can support one another and learn from one another is great. And all of those are pathways to evidence use. So that final comment is more just an observation that I think their approach to evidence use with these multifaceted strategies makes a huge amount of sense. So that's my very long-winded set of comments. I have lots of other things I can say, but could I turn it back to our colleagues if they're willing to just speak quickly about those points that I asked questions about, and then maybe we can open it up.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rob, for these very kind words and really helpful questions and comments. I think that's brilliant. So I'll take the synthesis one, and I think we'll go around the table here in Johannesburg answering them individually. So I think before I go into the outputs of the actual synthesis in more detail, I think just as a highest level, it might be helpful to mention that we have quite a diversity in methods for these syntheses. So it goes from the higher level types of syntheses, like an umbrella review, to a review of primary studies, to a scoping review, whatever you would like to call them, down to the actual methods of producing these. And there we have a commitment to starting from a mixed methods principle. So our default position would be to look at a question and see what is the best methodological approach, and assuming that we start from the idea that mixed methods is where we commence, and then we see what we can adapt. So that led us to quite a few reviews that have, in fact, in the end had a mixed method synthesis, for example, combining statistical meta-analysis with thematic synthesis. We've also experimented with qualitative comparative analysis. So at this intersection from more quantitative and more qualitative synthesis methods. And then the second higher level point maybe to mention up front is that from a sectoral point of view, most of our reviews are in the social, what some people call social sciences, or what we might be calling social policy issues here in South Africa. So while we've done reviews in healthcare, the majority of our reviews is in more social topics such as education, housing, the use of technology and innovation, state capability. And I think that's a function of the departments that we largely work with here in South Africa, who tend to be a bit more on the social policy side. So yeah, I think to have these two high-level points up front. And then so for the actual outputs, I think it can be best described as a spectrum. So we do quite a few of maybe what could be called gold standard systematic reviews. And by that, I mean reviews that are registered with some of the umbrella bodies like Cochrane, Campbell, or the collaboration for environmental evidence that you just mentioned. So this is, I think, a bit more as a funder who's got a higher level, maybe a global question for public good, and then we produce these reviews according to the guidelines by these umbrella organizations. And then at the other end of the spectrum, we have completely demand-driven systematic reviews, where a policymaker might tell us, well, in 2 weeks, I need to know everything there is to know about land reform in South Africa, which is the case you just referred to, because we have to make a big policy announcement. We want to understand the direction we're taking. Please collect all the evidence in that regard. So what do you do? So we try to stick to the principles that inform these higher level systematic reviews and adapt them to the needs. And so quite often we do rapid evidence assessments, so rapid reviews of primary evidence, taking a clean shortcut to adapt the high-level methods. But what we found in the last couple of years is that a key bottleneck between these two, of going towards the more rapid review methods, is that we don't have the evidence base in place that would allow us to do these syntheses rapidly. And there we've learned quite a bit from the master model and also from the EvidNet model more broadly, for example, at Makerere University, of how do you do a rapid response or a rapid review. And in order for us to do that effectively, we realized we need the evidence base in place. And there we adopted a method initially piloted by the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation, 3IE, called evidence gap maps, which is a higher level overview of the evidence in an interactive database. So I'd encourage you to have a look at their website to see how they look and feel. And in essence, where we've moved to now is trying to produce these evidence maps in strategic policy sectors so that we can do these rapid syntheses as rigorous and responsive as possible, because we kind of don't have to search for the evidence anymore. We don't have to extract the data per se. We have the evidence in place and we can move straight into the syntheses. And that's, to us, for example, the only way to respond to something like, in 2 weeks' time, tell us what we know about land reform in the entire country. So I hope that gave a bit of a spectrum of our outputs, and these maps and our reviews and our RIAs can all be found on our website, the Africa Center for Evidence.org. And coincidentally, we actually just published a blog on our evidence synthesis work on Friday, I believe. So if you want a kind of an exhaustive list of the types and outputs of evidence syntheses that we've produced, you might want to have a look at that blog, which is also on the Africa Center for Evidence website.
Thank you very much, Laurenz. I think I'll talk to the database for the AEN. Just I think in the past year, we had undertaken a process to consult our members in terms of what direction we should take, what services or resources that they require. From the annual member survey that we undertook last year, most of our members indicated that they are looking for resources in terms of capacity building, because we realize that most of our members are from different stages in terms of their experience and maybe educational level. So in terms of the people that responded to that survey, we found that some of them are still young researchers, people that are still coming into the sector. So they wanted more of this capacity sharing trainings, and they did not know where to go. So basically what we did, we looked at a number of training that is happening all over the continent and put it into a database. So if someone wants a training on monitoring and evaluation or systematic review or mapping, they can just go into the resource and find that training. So we're working on cleaning it and making sure that we have it as updated as possible. And what we've done also with this database, we're going to be hosting a webinar tomorrow on capacity sharing. So we introduce this to our members as well, so they know that this database is available. And also we've done a blog on it also, that it has been published. And some of the work in terms of capacity sharing and this database will be introduced in the conference we're attending in Ivory Coast with Afria. So those are some of the pieces trying to sort of promote this database so that our members can have access to. It is on our website, on the Africa Evidence Network website under resources, so people can be able to access it, and we update it on a regular basis to make sure that it is an updated version so that people can be able to source different capacity sharing events or activities that they are looking for to go to for themselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Siziwe. So I'm just going to come up with the last question, John. Thank you for your thoughtful comments. You asked us around Evidence 2018 and referred as well to Evidence 2020. So to those of you who might have been to a traditional research conference, kind of academic conference, or indeed to Cochrane Colloquium or Campbell Colloquium that focus on evidence synthesis, these conferences that we run every 2 years are quite different. We are focusing on the evidence communities and evidence networks across 6 dimensions. Siziwe hinted at them earlier. And so in those, we're spanning evidence production and use. So this is not just researchers presenting their work, it's the full spectrum. We're also spanning countries, and we have a pan-African scope, and that includes people working within Africa from outside, as well as a large number of Africans from a number of different countries. We span sectors, so as Laurenz hinted, we work within health, but actually most of our work is outside of healthcare, and I think that makes these events quite unusual. We also span all the different roles that you might imagine within government, within civil society, and across academia, as well as a whole range of other consultants and people working within this space. So there will be members of parliament there, all the way through to monitoring and evaluation officers for NGOs working on the continent, and pretty much everybody in between. We also interpret evidence very broadly. So this is not about our events saying you need to do the best possible systematic reviews according to the guidelines of Cochrane. And that's not to knock those guidelines. We have huge respect for Cochrane's work. But these events are about bringing people together across a wide interpretation of what evidence might be, to talk about how evidence is useful and how different types of evidence can inform decision-making processes. Which brings me to the last dimension, which is actually around the types of decisions that we discuss at those events and seek to inform. So the Evidence 2018 conference says there are a number of resources available through the africaevidencenetwork.org website. We're actually in the process of redesigning that website to make these resources more accessible. So if you take a look and want to know more, my suggestion is that you wait a couple of months and have another look, and it should all be slightly easier to access. We're starting a consultation now around Evidence 2020, because each time we hold one of these events, we learn. And because we're a networking organization in many ways, and we put relationships top of our priorities, we want to make sure that our conference also reflects that. So we're starting conversations now through webinars, through conferences, and through other discussions about key issues of importance to evidence-informed decision-making in Africa. And we will be building on those, so building conversations and dialogues, so that the conference Evidence 2020 in September in 2020 in Kampala in Uganda will build on those and be a real forum for discussion and workshopping, and not just a meeting where you sit down and watch other people's PowerPoint. So please do look out for further announcements about that. There'll be a lot more information and discussion and opportunity for you to input in the coming weeks and months. Thank you very much.
Fantastic, very helpful. If I can just say, I noticed in the participant list that you mentioned Uganda as having been a place that you've learned from, and I'm sure that's reciprocal. So that's Rona Madzumbi and her colleagues. I see on the participant list folks like Taryn, who's done amazing evidence synthesis work in the health space, Nazreen Jassani, who's been focused on the evidence uptake space. So I would encourage, if any others from the region want to complement these comments with your own observations about the many exciting things happening in Africa, please don't hesitate to. And before I forget, before the end of the webinar, it would be good if one of Ruth, Laurenz, or Siziwe could just quickly let people know what the best way to keep up to date on the Africa Center for Evidence and the Africa Evidence Network are, e-newsletters, Twitter, and so on. Just a quick run through of the best, of course, the website's there, but how to receive things from you would be helpful. So Steve, I'll push it back to you. I'm sure there are many questions.
Thanks, John. Yes, there is actually a few questions. So Ruth and team, I'll let you kind of decide who can best answer these. And some of them you may have already kind of covered off a bit in the other answers already. But the first one asked about what mechanisms or frameworks exist to measure, build, and evaluate evidence synthesis capacity.
Okay, I think that's a really good question. We probably will need our collective minds to answer that. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is that we've actually run a survey on measuring synthesis capacity in Africa. That is on a website, it's Capacity in Africa. And we were quite surprised what we found in that there were quite a few organizations who mentioned that they had synthesis capacity on the continent, which then sometimes doesn't quite match with, if you look who publishes and produces syntheses, in particular Campbell and Cochrane, where you don't find too many lead authors and lead teams of syntheses from Africa. But there was certainly an awareness and a familiarity with the methods itself. And I think the second striking thing was that there were kind of pockets of excellence and networks of centers for synthesis, or South African networks that we were part of, but also a network around the Makerere University in Uganda, who had their own approach to rapid syntheses. So you could kind of see how different approaches were cross-fertilizing. So that kind of practical experience. So if we were to look for existing frameworks, so I think there's not one model per se that you could use to assess synthesis capacity in my mind. So I think you need to run surveys, you need to then follow up and a bit more in-depth with stakeholder interviews. Something like social network analysis might be an interesting tool to look into. But yeah, I think that's as far as I go. So maybe my colleagues can give their reflections.
So if I jump in, it's Ruth here. I often quote, and she was online, but I think she's had to go, our colleague Karina van Rooyen, who has presented with me on building capacity for evidence synthesis. And she's always very humble in commenting that she has never once been on a training course herself, despite authoring a number of reviews. And she shares, and it's true of my experience, and I think of Laurenz's as well, that we learned how to do evidence synthesis and systematic reviews by doing them, by learning and being on review teams and hands-on mentorship, apprenticeship, and I think it's probably true to say with some of our government colleagues using a co-production model. So whilst I have been on training courses, and Cochrane and Campbell included, actually I've taught more than I've attended, and I've mostly learned from colleagues like Sandy Oliver at the Epicenter, where they have a in London, where they have a very much kind of mentorship, apprenticeship kind of role teaching evidence synthesis. That's how we teach our own colleagues here. And I also know Taryn can maybe say more, who's also online, but the Cochrane Centre here in South Africa has done a lot of work building capacity, which has involved a lot of intensive support for people working on their reviews rather than one-off workshops. I hope that answers that question for you.
Great, thank you. And Ruth was actually probably a question for you for this next one, but it's about the blog that you published recently with Beryl Leach that related to a point you made in the presentation about capacity building versus developing capacities. The question is, it would be great to know what you envisioned as wave 2 of supporting the development of capacities among policymakers and researchers in EIPM related skills.
So thank you for that question. I would actually bounce it back. And it's about picking up on some of the things that Siziwe and my colleagues here, we've been talking about this afternoon, this morning, which is around how we need to understand better what current capacities are there and where the gaps are, what work is already being done by colleagues across Africa. And I'm reminded repeatedly that when I think of a good idea, sitting at my desk, actually it's usually quite a poor idea and it needs a lot of improving through a lot of conversation with colleagues. So as part of that blog and part of the dialogue going forward, we actually really want to hear from other people about what their capacity development kind of wave 2 needs are and what is already being met and how can we ensure that the capacity that's built for the future, particularly across Africa, is meeting needs within the continent and isn't a flown-in project from outside and isn't an idea I think of on my desk on my own. And it might be quite possible for me to get funding at my desk on my own because I have some nice connections, but that's actually no good when it comes to meeting capacity development needs.
Great. Thanks, Ruth. So the next question is maybe a little bit more of a, I don't know if case study is maybe not quite the right description, but sort of an example. So in terms of, I guess, how you'd go about getting support from government and funding, etc. So the question is, if you're working on a program and you know it's useful for the community, however, there's no support from the government, how do you go about that problem? And what about if they expect the researcher to provide everything in terms of resources?
Okay, I'm thinking about the question as I'm starting to answer. And I think it's true to say in most of our work, we're never working on something that is entirely isolated from our government colleagues. So, for example, if somebody said, could we start working on a program to do evidence maps about gender violence, which is a request that came up recently and Laurenz has been doing some work on. One of our first responses would be to engage our government colleagues about it before we started working on that program. And I think that's one of the first steps in all that we're doing is to just touch base with colleagues who we know well within government. Is this something that they've already got a policy on, that they're already working on? So there's always a dialogue and we try to work. That's really why those relationships are the foundation for everything that we're doing, because we will always touch base with colleagues. And I think it's a legacy from our BQL work and from the personalities within our team that we do have a direct line to a whole range of colleagues in government and certainly kind of can be referred on to the right person to ask quite quickly. So that's a really valuable thing. You talked a little bit about resources as well. And it is a challenge around who resources any of the work that we're doing. And sometimes our funding is entirely independent from government. But actually quite a lot of our work has come through government in some way. Laurenz, I don't know if you've got anything to add on those, or Siziwe.
I would agree. I think, so we believe in co-production as a principle for our policy relevant work, which comes back to response that we will, in one way or another, always try to involve a government colleague. But I think that comes with an acknowledgement that this romantic version of co-production is this easy, great thing where we all agree on everything and just contribute equally. So we learned very quickly that that's probably not adequate, and that actually the process of co-production needs to be managed very carefully. And it's a pity that she's currently in London talking all things evidence there. But our government colleague Harsha Dayal, she actually developed quite a detailed and explicit model of how do you manage a co-production approach, all the way from how do you define terms of reference to commission a co-production project, to the nitty-gritty of how do I manage the big professor on the research process and the government researcher who is supposed to do coding that the professor has set up, and the two have never talked before. And it's really interesting because we had experiences where you needed that management of the relationship, really thought through management. We had researchers who didn't want to necessarily share their method with government. They believed they had the answer, and that was it. And likewise, we had government colleagues who felt they'd commissioned a piece of work. So they were, plainly speaking, a bit annoyed of us coming back to them and asking them, well, what do you think about this? How should we do that? What's your opinion? So, and throughout it, I think the point is that all of that needed to be managed. And Harsha has developed a model of how to manage that, which includes matchmaking, which includes TORs, drafting, and it's actually quite fascinating. It would need a webinar, I think, in its own right to hear about it. But I think that would be my point, that as much as we believe in that principle, you need a really detailed approach to manage it, which is quite a mouthful to do, actually.
Yeah, I think managing relationships with government, they take time. We should acknowledge the fact that they take time to build those relationships. Once those relationships are built, it's easier to manage how you work together. And I think developing a model, as Laurenz is saying, it makes things easier to make sure that you're able to work together and you sort of, agreed in terms of how this relationship is going to work. That makes things easier for both parties. Thank you.
Great. Well, I think there might be a few people that would benefit from that model. So I if it's not totally out of turn, I'd suggest that they could contact you for more information about it. But this next question actually kind of ties to that as well, because they're asking about under what circumstances, or if at all, you would advocate for a supply-led rather than a demand-led approach to EIPM, particularly in contexts where the concept is new. So, I mean, I'm sure you can imagine as you started off, and I'm sure there's other places where, whether it's building that relationship with a particular stakeholder or in a country where this model might not be used as much, how do you get that interest going?
Laurenz and I are pointing at each other in the hope that the other person will answer. Just a kind of instinctive response from me is that most of the time I think that's somebody else's job to do, actually, given that we have limited staffing, resources, experience and energy here at ACE, and we have great contacts with government, and that's really quite a unique thing. And so most of the time we would actually say no to a purely supply-led evidence synthesis or supply-led piece of work. We have done some, but they've become increasingly demand-led because we've manipulated the scope from the funders to make them demand-led because it's what we believe in. But I don't want to undervalue the idea of the global good systematic reviews that organizations like Cochrane and others do and bank for us in these extraordinary libraries that we mine to provide answers and certainly starting points for most of our discussions with government colleagues. So it's not to undermine the value of those, but that given our context, to be honest, it's rare for us to do supply-led work. Do you want to add to that, Ruth?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I have two thoughts. So one is it's a bit of a chicken and an egg. So sometimes without the supply-led work, we couldn't do what we do. So a resource like health and social system evidence, where we can go and pick up systematic reviews for our rapid syntheses, it's massively valuable. So, and same with Campbell and other libraries. So in a way, having the supply there makes our work much, much easier. So I think it's a bit of a chicken and an egg question. And then I think my second thought is around, well, who should advocate for EIPM? And I think that the risk I would see if EIPM is advocated too strongly by the research sector, it's a bit like we have a conflict of interest, because surely we want to advocate for the use of our evidence, and then we get commissioned to produce more of this great, incredibly useful evidence. So I would be a bit reluctant in a situation where there's no government demand at all to say the research sector should make that advocacy work. But then that opens the question, should it maybe be the civil society sector? Should it be citizens who should be calling on the government to have a more evidence-informed approach to decision making, seeing that their policies and programs affect citizens in the end quite strongly? So I think that's a bit more of a thought than an answer, but I think there's kind of a balance to be struck who should actually be the advocate for EIPM.
Great, thanks. So this next question probably won't be much easier for you, but it is very high level. So it's just what is one of the main challenges in translating knowledge into supporting policy making? So I'm sure there's lots of challenges, and under different circumstances there might be different ones. But if maybe each of you could kind of just pick one that comes to mind.
Maybe if I start us off, as far as our work's concerned, I think it is about limited staff capacity, time and energy to meet all the amazing demands that come to us that are actually very well informed and usually urgent and terribly important, and we really want to meet them. And it's hard for us to have the time and capacity and energy to meet them all. Laurenz, do you want to add, Siziwe?
No, I completely agree on trying to meet the demand, but I think something also quite often it's around the diversity in values, and I think what I was hinting at is a co-production management, that within the research sector you have different types of researchers, some of them more open to knowledge translation work, others not so much, and the same within government. You have policymakers who believe policies their realm, the researcher shouldn't be involved, and I think managing these values and trying to find on a systemic level an agreement at the overall value and the space for evidence. Like, what is the actual legitimate space for evidence in the policymaking process? So I think building that agreement and getting that value right, at least here in South Africa, has been quite an effort, and I don't think we're there by no means at all. And that's probably been one of the key challenges for me.
I think Siziwe is saying we've covered that, so back to you, Stephen.
Perfect, that's great. And Laurenz, this is a question for you, but have you found that your processes, either for capacity building or in the development of your products, differ based on the sector that you're working in? For example, health versus education or environment?
So yes and no. So I think yes, in that the final product usually looks different for each project. So not so much necessarily on a sectoral level, but we have to adapt the methods for each sector and then for each specific request to some extent. So we were just reflecting on it, that the data extraction that we just set up, the land reform evidence map, again, like it's just, you have to reinterpret concepts. You couldn't just pick it off the shelf, even though we've done 7 or 8 of these rapid requests over the last couple of years. But then where I don't think they don't differ, so the no answer is around the underlying principles. So I think the principle and methods for evidence synthesis from the health sector are equally applicable to the social sector and vice versa. So the innovations that might be happening in the social sector are equally applicable to the health sector. So I think I would probably take a stance that overall on a higher level from a principle, it's non-sectoral, so to speak.
Great. Okay. And I know John had asked before, and I don't want to forget before we end the webinar, but the information about how people can get in touch with the Africa Center for Evidence and your newsletters and other communication tools.
So I just made a note. There is an email address which can answer any of your questions about any of our work. It's a good starting place, which is ACE, A-C-E, at uj.ac.za. So that's ace@uj.ac.za. So if you email there with any kind of query about any of this work, it will be reverted on to the right person. If you're on Twitter and you want to follow us, the Africa Evidence Network is at Africa_evidence, and ACE is at ACE_UJ. That's the University of Johannesburg. So at ACE_UJ and at Africa_evidence. And if you use those as starting points, you'll find each of us personally and be able to connect to our work through there.
And Ruth, I know you have an excellent newsletter. I can't recall if you have separate ones for ACE and AEN. Is it the one for ACE which also covers AEN?
The other way around, actually.
Other way around.
It's the network, and we share work across different initiatives across the continent. So we're very happy to share news from other work that colleagues are doing. There's also some a section for more international work that colleagues in Africa might like to hear about. So if you either want to see what's happening across the continent or you want to share what's happening across the continent, if you send something through to that email address, we can make sure that it's part of the newsletter. And you can similarly ask to join the network. It's a very simple process. And then you'll receive our monthly newsletter as well.
Fantastic. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Ruth. I would definitely recommend that people do that for those who are interested, and certainly, as Ruth pointed out, for those of you who are on Twitter, their Twitter handles are both quite excellent ones to follow. So strongly recommend that. John, did you have any last thought questions?
Yeah, no, well, just to say again that I think, this is just such an incredibly fascinating group to follow. I think they do lots of superb stuff. As I said before, their humility, but also the rigor in their work, the demand-driven orientation. There's just so many reasons why I think it's a fascinating group to watch. And as Ruth just said, and I'm now reminded of it, I just pulled up an issue, the Africa Evidence Network newsletter, in keeping with this ethos, that's about promoting all of the rich resources available in Africa, but it's as relevant to many of us from outside. Their blog posts deal with highly topical issues. Their evidence reviews are often very, very innovative. So I think there's a lot that we can all learn from them. But as Ruth said, it's also a way to get out your own notices. So I would just encourage you to sign up for that newsletter. But thank you again to our colleagues at ACE and AEN for this superb contribution.
Yes, and I would just like to quickly thank all of you for joining as well. I think we're coming up to the end of the hour here, so we'll wrap things up. But just wanted to say thanks very much for joining us today. We really appreciate having you take part in this webinar and share your insights and knowledge on this really important topic.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.